Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and my guest today is Jonathan Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman actually asked that I call him John, is a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania. John, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, John, say a bit about your work and what you've been studying and interested in recent years as a scholar.
Well, I've spent my career studying the way that Americans have argued over education. One of the fascinating things about education, there are many, but what fascinates me is that we ask education, schools and universities to prepare citizens and to create a thriving democracy. But those citizens have no agreement about what schools and universities should do, and they never have. And so I've spent my career studying the way that they disagree over first alcohol and drug education, then history instruction, religion in schools, sex education, and more recently, higher education.
Mm. Yeah, I've seen some surveys that have been done that when people ask, what is it you want from public schools, and ask that of a broad spectrum of people, people generally come up with the same answers. They want them to be well informed. They talk about the same subject areas. They want them to try to treat other people well, uh, to be kind. Is there, do you think, more agreement?
I've seen those surveys too. And I think that in the abstract, we all want the things that you just described, but we disagree even about those things. That is, what does it mean to be a good citizen, for example? Everyone will tell posters they want schools to create good citizens. That's like liking rainbows and puppies, right? Nobody wants bad citizens. But when people say they want good citizens, they often have extraordinarily different ideas about what that term means.
Yeah, I can imagine that's true, that some might say, I want people that follow the law and do what they're told, and others that say, no, I want citizens who speak up.
Right, like your prior guest, Bruce.
Yeah, Bruce Wasser, we were talking before we started recording. He was a conscientious objector, and he wanted to teach his students in his high school history classes to stand up for principle. So listen, what I'm really excited about today is that I get to ask you, a bona fide educational historian, about a question I've been pondering for some time that has to do with compulsory schooling. And a little later, I'm going to have you provide a little historical context about this idea that for many, many decades, virtually every state has required students to go to school. But there's a couple of things that have happened in recent years, and one just emerged a couple of weeks ago that you've written about that makes me wonder about these compulsory education rules or laws that have existed in virtually every state in the country. The first thing I want to talk about is a court ruling, a Supreme Court ruling that was made just a couple of weeks ago, is Mahmoud versus Taylor. And I think it has, you'd agree with me, it has pretty far-reaching implications for schooling in America. But I have to say, these days, there's so much of what's going on in Washington and the Supreme Court. It seems to have far-reaching implications, including the Supreme Court just within the last day or two um, deciding that it was okay for the Trump administration to essentially dismantle the Department of Education and to fire thousands of people that work there. But I want you to talk a little bit about this Supreme Court ruling, Mahmoud versus Taylor. Provide a little basic background on what they decided, and then talk about the opinion you expressed in the Washington Post recently about that case.
Yeah, well, the very short story is a group of parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, complained to the school district about some elementary school texts that were, quote, LGBTQ friendly. They were stories that described families that had gay members and sometimes children that were transitioning or were themselves transgender. And their argument was not that these books should be removed. And I think this is a really important distinction because some people have lumped these parents in with, say, Moms for Liberty. I think that they're quite different because Moms for Liberty, you'll recall, led this effort to ban books like Genderqueer. That is not what these parents asked for. What they asked for was the right to opt their children out when those texts were being used. So it's a different demand. And they did so on First Amendment grounds, both freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. The lead plaintiff in the case, Mahmoud, he and his wife are Muslims, and they joined hands with some conservative Christians, which is what in my sex ed book I call the strange bedfellow effect. Because every single account I've ever seen of that kind of alliance uses the metaphor strange bedfellow because it's cute and it works. Because we're talking about people that often agree about nothing else, right? Including immigration, right? Let's remember that's one of the hot button issues now. And I would aver that Mahmoud and his wife probably disagree strongly with their allies in this case about immigration. But on this matter, they agree. And what the court said was that the school does, in fact, have to allow them to opt out. Now, we do have precedents for opting out. I mentioned sex ed, and that's the classic one. Classic because now almost every state has some sort of opt-out provision. So when you're having sex ed, if you don't want your kid to be in it, you sign a form and then they leave the room when it's happening. Over time, also, there have been opt-out provisions around evolution and creation. That is, if you don't want your kid exposed to instruction about evolution, you can have them opt out. Um, but nobody's ever gone this far in the sense of, entered into the quote regular curriculum. That is something that isn't a special subject like sex ed or evolution. And so I think it's way too close, way too soon to discern, what effect this is going to have. I think there's been a lot of very understandable concern among teachers and educators that this will lead to an infinite regress of opt-out requests, and anyone can opt out of anything. So, if your parents are January 6 protesters, can you opt out of a lesson about the 2020 election, which teaches the truth, which is the election was not stolen? And the people who assaulted the people's house were deeply, deeply misinformed and misguided by the losing candidate, who was at that time Donald Trump. Can you opt your kid out of that? I think it's too soon to tell. I think that's a deep concern. But, it's also worth noting that in the case of sex ed and also of evolution, the number of parents who have requested opt-outs has gone radically down. In fact, with evolution, it almost never happens anymore. So to me, that suggests that although, of course, we should be concerned about this, we shouldn't jump to the worst case scenario, which is this infinite regressive opt-outs.
You know what I've been thinking about, John, is whether paradoxically if we're concerned about students not being well educated, whatever that means, but learning what is in sort of the basic academic standards in most states about that would include evolution, and it might even include this idea of inclusivity that would include stories that might be about LGBTQ families and so forth, that the most effective way to respond to that, if we want the fewest kids opting out of that, is to essentially do nothing. Is just say, if you want to opt out, okay, your kid's not going to, even if, might be useful for your kids to learn about evolution, even if you don't want them to believe in it. At least they can then say, I know about it. But the less resistance might result in the fewest people opting out. The more we resist and say that's wrong and you shouldn't be doing that, I wonder if more people might respond to that, and leaders might get up, and religious leaders, and say, no, you really have to. You think there's any validity to that?
Look, again, I think it's too soon to tell, but I also think that you're pointing to another very interesting tension, even contradiction in this whole discussion. The three justices that objected, who were the ones the predictable ones, Sotomayor and Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson. In Sotomayor's opinion, which I believe the other two joined, she says, look, we live in a multicultural society and we have to teach people how to do that. And that means living with people who are different from you and learning about different families. And I hear that. But at the same time, if you take multiculturalism seriously, it's not just about like people's food or their dress, it's about their ways of life. Um, and, I think that there is an irony for those of us on the left, and I include myself. We want to be pro-immigrant. We want to be multicultural. We want to celebrate the reds and the greens and the blues and the oranges, the whole rainbow. But we also want everyone, say, to have comprehensive sex education or everybody to learn about transgender children. And it may well be that some of this glorious rainbow that we celebrate isn't into that, Ken. When I was doing my sex ed book, I remember reading about a Somali family that they came to the United States and they discover almost as soon as they get there that their 15-year-old daughter is in a class where they're putting condoms on bananas. I think that you can predict that this Somali family was not extraordinarily psyched about that. Now, look, one response to that, and I think it's a cogent response, is kind of tough noogies. You chose to come to America. This is what we do here. Get with the program. But in many other idioms and instances, I think people on the left are loath to do that. They don't want to, they're not going to say, hey, you came here to learn our language and only our language. Learn our history or a patriotic version, the one we call patriotic. Assimilate to our ways. I think in many other realms, we on the left are much more solicitous of these differences. But when it comes to this subject, I think we're more willing to run roughshod over them. And I think that's complicated and interesting.
So let me bring up a sort of related issue, related in my mind, and I'll see if you think it's related. And ultimately, I think it might tie back to this question I had about compulsory schooling. And I want to talk for a moment about homeschooling, which is the fastest growing form of education in America. Currently, there are about 4 million kids that are homeschooled. It's a relatively small number at this point, but it's growing. I think most people would say that homeschooling is a really great thing for families whose kids maybe aren't thriving in traditional public school. It's another option. Some parents come together and do wonderful things with their kids. They create these co-ops and they get very rich experiences. What we also know is that in 9 states, there are virtually no regulations, no accountability whatsoever. You don't even have to inform the school. You basically can keep your kids at home. They can sit on the couch and play on their device. They can work in the field, so to speak, which is one of the reasons I think states said that we're not going to allow that because parents can exploit their kids. They can teach nothing if they so choose. And I actually had a couple of podcast guests on a show we did on homeschooling. One of them was a woman now in her 20s who was homeschooled, and she didn't learn math from her parents because her parents said girls don't need to learn math. You won't use it. In fact, they're not particularly good at it. She really regretted it later and ended up getting an apology from her parents who realized that might have been a mistake. The other guest, Weston Brown, homeschooled in Texas. He never learned anything about evolution, only creationism. He also learned, he got these homophobic themes, presented to him, and it turned out he was gay, and he hasn't spoken to his parents. But I think parent rights people say a parent has a right to educate their children any way they want. And of course, I want to say, but does that if they say they don't want to educate them at all, they'll work for me, and somehow. So I wonder what your thoughts are about. Maybe it's a small number.
Well, first of all, it's not a small number.
Mhm.
I mean, there may be as many kids getting homeschooled in America now as there are in charter schools. We don't know. And we don't know precisely because what you were saying earlier, because of the states that don't require you to submit any paperwork or any information about this. We don't even have the data. I mean, Ken, think about this. Every year you have to get your car inspected, right? You're a Californian. I'm sure you have several cars. And the reason you do is because you share the road, right? I think that's the theory, right? that you're out there on highways with lots of other drivers, and the public good requires you to keep your car in sufficient shape so it doesn't endanger other people. Now, you may not like it, but I think you abide by it. They always find something you have to fix and it costs you money, but you do it, right? Isn't it amazing that in the 9 states you're talking about, you have to get your car inspected, but homeschooling is in no way inspected? And of course, we all share a metaphoric role with our fellow citizens. I'm not, quote, against homeschooling, but I am against unregulated homeschooling. Because it seems to me to your earlier point that all of us have an interest in the education of all of our children. They can and will obtain that education in different environs and different idioms, including private schools and parochial schools. But those schools, by the way, are regulated. Private and parochial schools are highly regulated. They have to abide by curriculum codes. There are other kinds of health measures. They also, by the way, receive public assistance. And I'm not talking now about vouchers or any of that stuff, right? Since 1947, they've received public assistance for textbooks and for transportation. I said 47 because that was a Supreme Court case upholding that. And so all of us have an interest in the education of all of our kids. And if somebody's getting homeschooled without any kind of regulation or oversight, we can't know what they're learning. We can't fulfill our duty to them.
So isn't there a tension between this rise of interest in parental rights and it's, look, it's my kid, and it's my religion. I can have them opt out of this class or that class. Now the Supreme Court has supported that. I can homeschool them, and it's not the state's business to look and see what I'm doing. They have to assume that I'm doing the best for my kid, and it's not any of their business.
Right. And look, I'd like to emphasize that this is not new, this argument. In fact, if you go back to the 1920s, the Pierce v. Society of Sisters case, it's that case where the Supreme Court says the child is not the mere creature of the state, and the parent is the first educator. So that was the case where the state of Oregon actually required everyone to go to public schools. It was an anti-Catholic measure. The Ku Klux Klan had enormous power in Oregon at the time. We think about the Klan as an anti-Black, as a racist organization, which of course it was, but it was also profoundly anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. And it wielded an extraordinary power in Oregon, and it pushed through this law requiring everyone to attend public schools. And what the court said in Pierce v. Society of Sisters, right? Of course, it's it's a Catholic order. They said that you can require kids to go to school, but not to public schools. So that's the bargain that we made. The state can, in fact, require you to be schooled, but it can't designate where, which is what Oregon was trying to do. And it's in that case where they said, you're not the child is not the mere creature of the state. The child is actually the product of parents. And we have to respect the parental will here. But to your earlier point, that respect had limits. So if you're a parent and you say, okay, my kid's not going to be schooled at all, we're not going to respect that. But if you say, hey, I'm Catholic, I want my kid to go to a Catholic school instead of your public school, we do and we must respect that.
I mentioned a man that I interviewed, actually done a couple of interviews with him, Weston Brown. He was homeschooled in Texas. Texas, like every other state, has compulsory schooling laws, but one of the options that satisfies that requirement is homeschooling, and yet it's one of the 9 states that has not only does not have any regulations, you don't even have to report to the school that you're homeschooling. And many other states at least say you have to let us know, and you have to do a little bit of paperwork. And some states, of course, are much more highly regulated, and you can lose the right to homeschool if you can't demonstrate that your kids are learning what the state expects you to teach. But so they say, yes, you have to go to school in Texas, but you can do it all kinds of ways, including homeschooling. So it raises in my mind this idea of opt-out combined with states like Texas and 8 others that allow students to be homeschooled with virtually no regulation, it makes me wonder whether these compulsory education laws that have been around for a long time are really relevant. And if you would maybe just go back for our listeners and talk about how long compulsory schooling laws have been in effect and why they were put into effect way back.
Well, compulsory schooling laws in this country mostly date to the late 19th century, which was a time of, enormous flux in the United States, a huge industrial revolution that was powered literally and figuratively by 20 million immigrants from mostly from, at that time, Eastern and Southern Europe, including my relatives, and I would also guess yours, the Great Wave between 1880 and 1917. And that that wave created enormous inequalities, enormous poverty in some places, industrial accidents, child labor, and all of these dimensions created a movement to make sure that kids up until a certain age were not working in a coal mine, which some of them did, or in a factory, and they weren't running around the streets. They were in school. And it's important to note that many of these laws were opposed quite vehemently by members of immigrant communities and by the working class, because they saw these laws as an effort to prevent them from prospering. One of the great myths of American history is that education has been a route to social mobility. It has in some cases, but in most of them, education comes after mobility, not before. So if you look at most of the immigrants in the period we're talking about, their goal is always the same. It's to own property. Because in America, that was easier to do than in most parts of Europe. So how do you do that? You put every single family member into the workforce. And then once you have a degree of mobility, I guess, a better word would be security, then you'll send your kids to school. Jews were an enormous exception to this. Jews generally put their kids into the schools almost right away. But again, they were exceptional. So that's where the compulsory labor laws come from, and they're contested.
John, wasn't there also a rationale for compulsory education that, after the Civil War, we need an educated citizenry to for America to thrive and to come together. We can't. Not only is it we want to avoid the exploitation of children, but we want to make sure that as people vote and participate, I mean, even, blacks weren't voting, women weren't voting yet, but we really, I think states believed that we needed an educated citizenry. Isn't that part of the justification?
Absolutely. And look, that rationale, the civic rationale, goes back to Horace Mann and the Common School movement in the early 1840s. That's Mann's fundamental argument. If we're going to be a republic with a small r, we need to educate Republicans, again, with a small r. We need to educate people with the capacity to govern themselves. And that means, you mentioned women not voting, that meant both boys and girls. Mann's argument was the girls were going to be Republican mothers, again, small r, right? They needed to learn about civics so they could be teachers of their children in these civic virtues. But I think your point is extremely well taken. I think the anxieties around all of that, who's going to become a citizen? How are they going to be citizens? How will they become Americans? I think that heightens after the Civil War because of the volume of people coming to this country, which was radically more than before. And also because, a lot of those people weren't Protestant and they weren't from Northern or Western Europe, which is where most Americans came from before this time. So Horace Mann is very worried about the Irish, of course, and that's but at least the Irish speak English or some version of it, right? And I think to a lot of native-born Americans, people who are Catholics and Jews from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe are a greater threat and are seen as more in need of Americanization. And you're right, compulsory education was absolutely a part of that.
Do you worry about the future of compulsory education given these homeschooling trends that we talked, unregulated homeschooling and opt-out provisions?
I would say, frankly, my worry is broader than that,
Mm.
Ken. My worry is about the broader civic function of schooling. Um, it's not that I'm unconcerned with what you're talking about,
Hmm.
but look, most Americans are not homeschooled. Most Americans go to their local public school. That's still where it happens. But to continue the metaphor, what happens there? And I would argue the answer is not enough.
Mm.
And how do I know that? Just open the daily newspaper and look at how deeply alienated we are from each other as Americans. Look at our inability to speak and communicate across our differences. Ken, I'm not saying that schools are the lone culprit here, because of course they're not. But schools remain, they remain our central public institution for, yes, to your point, schooling citizens, making citizens. Um, and I don't see how anybody can look around America and say that we've been successful in doing that. So, yeah, am I worried about compulsory education? Well, sure, but I'm worried about education,
Yeah, yeah.
right? I'm worried that we've lost the plot, and that we don't actually have a real nation anymore of people that see themselves as having something in common. And again, I don't want to put all the onus on schools, but again, they do have a unique role in this process, and I don't see how anybody could say that they're succeeding in it.
Yeah, and you've written about this, and I've certainly talked to a number of people, including Diana Hess. She's written a book about this, how essential it is, especially today, that students learn to talk with each other about controversial topics, about politics, and if they don't learn it, how to do it there, where will they learn it? And probably will end up only speaking with people that think like them. But I think what you were alluding to is that more and more there's pressure on teachers in public schools to stay away from those topics because they can be accused of indoctrinating or trying to push one point of view over another. So the choice that many teachers make is, I'm just not, like, there was a recent survey after the most recent presidential election, and asking teachers how comfortable are you teaching about the presidential election? Many said, I just don't do it before or after.
And look, I mean, Ken, I think that's unacceptable.
Hmm.
I don't want to blame the teachers. I understand 100% why they do that. They're not people in our culture that are accorded a lot of professional respect. And often they don't have many legal rights. This is all real. And Emily Robertson and I wrote a book about this called The Case for Contention. And one of the things we discovered is that, a lot of teachers are afraid, and they've been afraid for a very long time. Um, but if we can't talk about the election, we can't actually teach people how to be
Hmm.
citizens. Again, I don't begrudge the teachers this, I understand that. But at the same time, the rest of us need to we need to rally behind our schools and actually demand that they address these questions.
So is there a way out of this, John? I mean, what is the way out? How do we make compulsory education, the kids that actually are in school,
Yes.
uh, get the kind of education that produces good citizens? And I don't mean good in the sense that they align to one ideology or another, but are thoughtful citizens that know how to talk with each other.
Ken, John Dewey said that the answer to the problem of democracy is more democracy.
Mm.
And I think that's right. And I think that if enough Americans wanted their schools to be different, they would be. The schools are not created by Moses on Mount Sinai, who hands down a bunch of tablets. The schools are created by citizens. And this is that interesting tension, right? They're created by citizens to create citizens, right? But they're created by citizens who don't agree about what citizens are or should be. But that's the wedge, that's the opening. So, for those of us who care about this, we need to make the democratic case for democratic schooling. if I were king, and we don't have enough time this afternoon to enumerate all the reasons that will not come to pass, but if I were king, every Wednesday at noon or midday would be the America Hour. And here's how it would work. If you lived in Lower Manhattan in a really politically blue area, you and your school, the students and the teachers would be patched through to a sister or brother school in northern Alabama, like in the reddest part of political America. And one Wednesday you talk about gun control, and the next Wednesday you talk about reproductive rights. The Wednesday after that you talk about Ukraine. Ken, we could do this. This isn't rocket science, right? We don't have the will to do it. And those of us who care about the future of democracy have to promote and create that will.
And let me just offer a friendly amendment to what you just said. And it comes from the conversation I had with a history civics teacher in Fremont, California, which happens to be tends to be more conservative in that community. She
But
was
also very
on,
diverse, extremely
and
diverse.
right,
Yeah.
and what she said, and she was on with her principal, which was important, that she continues to teach history and deal with the talks about the election and all of the things she's always talked about, and she does it freely and without fear from parents. And the reason it works for her is that she communicates really well with her parents of her kids. She invites them in. She's been at the school a long time. She's a trusted educator. Her parents, even not despite the fact that they're conservative, but they trust her that they're educating their children in an honest way to get them to be good thinkers and to
Right.
consider multiple points of view. And her principal was there on the podcast saying, "I fully support her. I have no trouble with what she does because the parents like and appreciate what she does." So I think expanding on this idea of democracy, educators would be well advised, I think, to reach out and form more trusting relationships with the parents in their community, the parents of their kids.
Absolutely. And look, I think the history piece is important here because whatever the virtues or vices of the one-room schoolhouse, which I also wrote a book about, there was a tight bond between the community and the school. In
Mm,
fact,
mm.
the school was the community,
Oh,
right? I mean, the schoolhouse was often the only public building in the community. And it isn't just where you voted, because it still is, but it's where there were like, Christmas parties and plays and other kinds of theater and music. And so everyone knew each other, right? And of course, in an industrial and a post-industrial society, that's going to be less likely because there's so much flux, people moving from here and there.
mhm.
So it becomes more of a challenge to create those bonds. It's not impossible, but it's harder. The other thing that makes it harder is social media, right? John
Mhm.
Dewey didn't know about social media. But without social media, there would be no such thing as, for example, Moms for Liberty. And there probably wouldn't be Donald Trump, right? Who I think figured out the special sauce of really how to use social media in a instrumental way, a politically instrumental way. So um, uh, Moms for Liberty often, targets teachers, I think, like the one you're talking about. And I'm glad you didn't name her because I don't want Moms for Liberty to interfere with her in any way. But this was not something that was likely or even possible in earlier eras, right, where the modes of communication were so different. Um, I think Moms for Liberty speaks to two things. One, it speaks to, again, this social media piece, the rapidity with which you can target somebody on a different state, a different time zone, a different part of the country. And also, I think, and this kind of goes with the earlier comment, the nationalization of a question that used to be really a local one. Education historically has been a local concern. And you just said in your example, right? The teacher knows the people in her
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
So it remains that. But at the same time, I think that, again, because of different modes of communication, also because of the way that the issues have been politicized, I think there's been a nationalization of these questions. Education has become a national political issue in ways that I think it's never been. Um, and there are limits to that too. I mean, one way of thinking about the Ron DeSantis story is he thought he could use that issue to become president, right? Because, he had expended so much effort in trying to like fight woke things in Florida and create the Don't Say Gay bill and things like that. But it didn't really resonate on a national level. And it's funny, this seems like so long ago, but it was a year ago. Um, Donald Trump says a lot of things that are untrue, but just like the cliche, a clock is right twice a day,
Hmm.
he's sometimes right. And you may recall that when he was battling with DeSantis, at one point he said, woke, woke, woke. All this guy says is woke. What does that even mean? And he was right. It's like
Yeah.
this free-floating signifier. Nobody is entirely sure of the definition. But my point is, DeSantis believed that he could ride this anti-woke thing to the White House, but he didn't. But even the fact that he thought that was possible, I think, speaks to something new in the politics of education.
Yeah. Well, John, you've given me and our listeners a whole bunch to think about. There's a lot on the line here.
There is. And if I may, just one other comment, as I mentioned the nationalization of education, I think what we've seen in Trump 2.0 is an enormous tension and contradiction. Because the same party that says we don't need a Department of Education, and just this week, the Supreme Court kind of agreed. That's not what they said exactly, but they said Trump can fire as many people there as he wants, which is essentially removing the Department of Education. The same party that wants that also has a president who's issuing executive orders saying things like you can't teach critical race theory or DEI or gender theory.
Yeah.
So this is really complicated and contradictory. On the one hand, we're saying we don't need a Department of Education because this should be a state and local concern. But at the same time, we're issuing unprecedented executive orders from the White House telling everybody what they can and can't study.
Yeah, it's a politics of convenience. Just when it serves our interests, you can promote it. When it doesn't, you don't.
Yeah,
And then by the time people say, "Well, isn't there a contradiction there?" and you move on to the next subject, and we don't linger a lot on the coherence of policies and arguments too much. You do what you do because you feel justified, and it doesn't necessarily have to cohere.
right. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks, John, for joining me. It's just great having uh, being able to talk with a historian to put some of this stuff in perspective. And I like your comment that less concerned about the potential loss of compulsory education, more concerned about what's actually happening among the 97% of people that are in school that are regulated, that are expecting things to happen, and the things that are happening aren't necessarily what's good for the future of our country or our democracy.
Correct.
So I think with that, John, I'm going to thank you for being part of courageous conversations about our schools.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
And listeners, you can hear this and all of our episodes at schoolconversations.org or wherever you get your podcasts. So long, everyone.